In this video, we're diving into the stories of prisoners who are set to face execution in 2025. We'll uncover the dark crimes they've committed, the legal battles they've fought, and the chilling details surrounding their final moments. Brace yourself as we reveal some truly haunting stories. But before we get into it, if you want to stay informed about these stories, as well as other gripping crime cases and true crime content, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Join our community and never miss an update. You're not going to want to miss what's coming next. Michael Mahadi. The name Michael Mahadi will forever be linked to a horrific crime spree that spanned multiple states. It all began in July 2004 when 21-year-old Michael embarked on a violent journey of theft and murder. Armed with a stolen gun and a stolen car, Mahadi made his way from Virginia to North Carolina, where he took the life of a store clerk. But he didn't stop there. In South Carolina, he carjacked another victim, continuing his reign of terror. As law enforcement closed in, Mahadi managed to evade capture for days. He found shelter in a shed behind the home of Officer James Meyer in Orangeburg, South Carolina. What happened next was nothing short of brutal. When Officer Meyer returned home after a family celebration, Mahadi ambushed him. 7 shots rang out, striking Meyer before Mahadi set his body ablaze. The gruesome scene was discovered by Meyer's wife, who found his lifeless body in the very shed where they had once taken their wedding photos. It was a haunting end for a family man. 3 days later, Mahadi was caught in Florida, but his conviction for Officer Meyer's murder sealed his fate. Now, as his execution looms, Mahadi has made a chilling choice. He's opted for death by firing squad, a decision that his attorney describes as one made under duress. Faced with the choice of a fiery electric chair or a slow and agonizing death by lethal injection, Mahadi chose what he considered the lesser evil. If his execution goes ahead, Mahadi will become the 5th inmate in South Carolina to face execution in less than 7 months. And if he dies by firing squad, he will join the ranks of only 2 others in modern U.S. history who have met their end in such a manner. The date to mark, April 11th, 2025. Moises Mendoza, Texas. The story starts on March 17, 2004, when Relly Tolson, a young mother from Farmersville, Texas, vanished without a trace. Her 5-month-old daughter Avery was left behind in the house. The next morning, her mother arrived to find a scene of chaos. Furniture was overturned, the mattress and box springs displaced, and the headboard shattered. But the most haunting discovery was baby Avery, alone, lying on the bed. The investigation quickly led police to Moises Mendoza, who had attended a party at Tolson's home days earlier. After his arrest, Mendoza confessed to the brutal murder. His chilling confession revealed that he had lured Tolson into his truck, making her abandon her infant daughter. What followed was a horrifying account of violence. Mendoza claimed he strangled Tolson, drove her to a field behind his house, and continued his assault. He then stabbed her to make sure she was dead, leaving her lifeless body in a remote location. But the horror didn't end there. Mendoza disposed of her body by burning it. 6 days later, the charred remains were found, and authorities quickly tied the crime to him. At the time, Mendoza was already wanted for aggravated assault and robbery dating back to 2003. Now 40 years old, Mendoza is facing execution on April 23, 2025. He's been on death row for nearly 2 decades, well past the average wait time in Texas, which is around 11 years. But the clock is ticking, and Mendoza's fate is sealed. James Ozgood. On October 13, 2010, the lifeless body of Tracy Brown was discovered in her home after she failed to show up for work. The scene was chilling. Authorities found her unclothed, her body marred by brutal wounds, particularly to her back and neck. The immediate suspicion was foul play. It didn't take long for investigators to focus on James Ozgood and his girlfriend, Tanya Van Dyke, both of whom had been the last to see Tracy alive. At first, Ozgood's account seemed relatively harmless. He admitted to spending the day with Tracy, running errands, cashing her paycheck, and paying bills. But as the investigation continued, the story took a dark turn. Ozgood's confession grew more disturbing by the hour. He revealed that he and Van Dyke had engaged in intimate relations with Brown on the day she was murdered. But that wasn't where the horror ended. A month after his arrest, Ozgood provided an unsettling confession. He disclosed that he had been inspired by a television show about kidnapping and torture, a show that ignited a twisted fantasy he had shared with his girlfriend. The couple had initially planned to find a random victim, but their choice fell upon Tracy Brown. What followed was unimaginable. Once they returned to Brown's trailer, Van Dyke slapped Tracy to signal the beginning of their assault. Ozgood then restrained Brown, pushing her into unconsciousness, before dragging her into the bedroom. There, the couple subjected her to sexual violence, threatening her with a weapon. When Brown attempted to flee, Ozgood caught her, dragging her by the hair back into the bedroom. It wasn't long before Ozgood revealed a knife and used it to deliver the fatal blow to Brown's throat. After Tracy's life was extinguished, Ozgood cleaned himself in the bathroom before he and Van Dyke left the scene, heading to Van Dyke's house to carry on as if nothing had happened. Ozgood was convicted of murder in 2014, receiving the death penalty. However, in a surprising turn, an appeals court overturned the sentence, citing improper jury instructions. When he was resentenced in 2018, Ozgood stunned everyone by requesting the death penalty himself, stating his belief in an eye for an eye. A few years later, he openly admitted, "I really screwed up. I'm guilty, and I deserve death. That's what I want." At 55, James Ozgood is now facing execution by lethal injection on April 24, 2025 in Alabama. His former girlfriend, Tanya Van Dyke, pleaded guilty for her role in the murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Jeffrey Hutchinson, Florida. On September 11, 1998, Jeffrey Hutchinson made headlines for the horrific mass murder of his live-in girlfriend and her 3 children in Crestview, Florida. Hutchinson had been living with Renee Flitty and her 3 young children, Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan, since 1997. The family had moved from Spokane, Washington, as Renee was estranged from her military husband stationed in Alaska. On the evening of the murders, after months of cohabitation, Hutchinson and Renee got into a heated argument. After storming off, he packed some clothes and guns into his truck and drove to a local bar where he drank away his anger. He openly told the bartender he was furious with Renee, but what happened when he returned home would forever change their lives. Armed with a Mossberg 12-gauge pistol-grip shotgun, Hutchinson stormed into their home and began shooting. Within an hour, Renee and all 3 children were dead. The shocking brutality of the crime didn't end with their deaths. Hutchinson's second shot to Jeffrey, the young boy, ensured that he wouldn't survive the initial wound to the chest. After the murders, Hutchinson called the police to report the deaths, claiming 2 men wearing ski masks had broken into the house and committed the crime. Alternatively, he argued that he had been too intoxicated to form the intent for murder, framing it as a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder. The prosecution wasn't convinced by Hutchinson's defense. After a swift 9-day trial, Hutchinson was found guilty of all 4 murders on January 18, 2001. Just a few weeks later, he was sentenced to death for the children's murders, while he received a life sentence for Renee's murder. The judge cited Hutchinson's lack of a criminal history and his military service as factors in the decision to spare him for the murder of Renee, but the cold-blooded execution of the children was deemed especially heinous. In a rare and final twist, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Hutchinson's death warrant on April 1, 2025. Hutchinson, now awaiting his fate, is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on May 1, 2025, at Florida State Prison. Matthew Lee Johnson, Texas. May 1, 2012, marked the beginning of a horrific crime in Garland, Texas. Matthew Lee Johnson, a 25-year-old man, entered a local gas station with a sinister plan in mind. Armed with nothing but a water bottle filled with lighter fluid, he approached 76-year-old clerk Nancy Harris. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Without warning, Johnson poured the flammable liquid over Harris while demanding money. Harris, an elderly woman who had likely seen her fair share of difficult customers, complied. She handed over cash, cigarettes, and even the ring off her finger, hoping to avoid conflict. But Johnson wasn't satisfied. In a shocking act of cruelty, he set Harris on fire, all while casually grabbing some candy on his way out of the store. Severely burned and fighting for her life, Harris staggered outside in a desperate bid for help. It was there that officers spotted her, calling for an ambulance just in time. She was rushed to the hospital with burns covering 40% of her body. Despite her strength, Harris couldn't overcome the brutal injuries, and 5 days later, she succumbed to the pain. Johnson didn't make it far. He was arrested soon after, trying to break into nearby homes. In a chilling twist, Harris's ring was found in his pocket. In court, Johnson showed remorse, admitting he felt like scum for what he'd done. He pleaded for mercy, not for himself, but for the sake of his family, especially his children and wife. "I have to live with this the rest of my life if I'm able to live," he said, his voice filled with regret. Now, as Johnson faces the consequences of his actions, he is scheduled for execution by lethal injection on May 20th, 2025, at the Huntsville State Penitentiary in Texas. Oscar Franklin Smith, Tennessee. On October 1st, 1989, in Nashville, Tennessee, a horrifying crime unfolded that would forever scar a family. Oscar Franklin Smith, a man estranged from his wife, Judy Roberts Smith, and consumed by jealousy and rage, brutally took the lives of Judy and her two sons, Chad and Jason Burnett. What motivated the savage attack was a twisted combination of financial gain and deep resentment. At the time, Smith had taken out insurance policies on all three victims. His co-workers later testified that Smith had repeatedly threatened to kill his wife in the months leading up to the murders. One co-worker even recalled Smith saying he would harm the children, believing Judy treated them better than their own twins. The night of the murders, the family's desperate cries for help echoed through their home. Chad, in his final moments, screamed, "Frank, no!" before being silenced by Smith's rage. A chilling clue was left at the crime scene. A bloody palm print, missing 2 fingers, matching Smith's own physical features. It was damning evidence that sealed his fate. Smith was convicted of the triple homicide in 1990, and the jury sentenced him to death. Since then, he has fought for his life, filing numerous appeals and seeing his execution dates postponed multiple times, most recently due to issues surrounding Tennessee's lethal injection protocols and the COVID-19 pandemic. Smith's fate was delayed again in 2022, but in March of 2025, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee signed a new death warrant. Now, Oscar Franklin Smith's execution is set for May 22nd, 2025, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. Daryl Drafin, Louisiana. In April 2000, Shreveport, Louisiana, became the backdrop for an unimaginable crime. Daryl Drafin, a man whose name would soon be linked to a brutal act of violence, murdered his 64-year-old neighbor, Loretta White, in her own home on East Boulevard Street. It wasn't just a crime. It was an act of savage cruelty. When Loretta's adult son arrived at her house, he was met with a horrifying sight. His mother's lifeless body sprawled in a pool of blood. The brutality of the attack was staggering. Loretta had suffered 61 separate knife wounds, a level of violence that is almost too difficult to comprehend. The shockwaves of this murder rippled through the community, leaving people wondering, what could drive a person to commit such an atrocity? Drafin was arrested shortly after the murder, and in 2003, he was convicted and sentenced to death. But his case didn't end there. For years, he appealed the decision, hoping to overturn the conviction. Now, after 2 decades, Drafin's final day has arrived. Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry made a significant announcement in February 2025, stating that the state would resume executions using a controversial new method, nitrogen hypoxia, a process that replaces lethal injection. As May 28, 2025 draws near, Drafin's attorneys continue their fight to stop the execution. But with the state's new execution protocol in place, the clock is ticking, and Drafin faces the consequences of a crime that shocked a community. The Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola will be the place where Drafin meets his fate. Marcus Reed, Louisiana. The night of August 16, 2010, marked the end of 3 young lives in a Louisiana town. Marcus Reed, fueled by a mistaken belief and a simmering anger, committed a cold-blooded ambush that would alter the lives of an entire family forever. The victims: Jeremiah, Jarkus, and Gene Adams, 3 brothers who paid the ultimate price for a crime they didn't commit. Reed had been convinced that the Adams brothers had stolen an Xbox gaming console from his girlfriend's home. In his mind, there was no room for doubt, and the resolution was violence. He took matters into his own hands, setting the stage for a tragic confrontation that would forever haunt those who knew the victims. The scene that greeted Coteau Parish Sheriff's deputies was chilling. The brothers' bodies were found in Jeremiah's car, parked in Reed's yard. The car's windows were shattered, and one of the brothers' bodies was found stuffed into the trunk. The medical examiner's report painted a picture of sheer brutality. Jarkis had been struck at close range while lying motionless on the ground. Gene had suffered multiple gunshot wounds, and Jeremiah had been shot 7 times, including a fatal wound to the back of his head. Investigators found a semi-automatic rifle hidden under Reed's porch, as well as a blood-stained tank top in an abandoned school bus nearby. The pieces of the crime fell into place, and Reed's story crumbled. During his trial, Reed claimed the murders were justified, arguing that one of the brothers had been involved in a burglary. However, the jury wasn't swayed by his defense. They heard witness testimony that contradicted Reed's account and presented evidence that he had emerged from the woods, guns blazing, targeting the unarmed brothers. In 2013, Reed was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and the Louisiana Supreme Court upheld the verdict. His appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court were denied, and now, nearly 15 years after the murders, Reed's execution looms. Set for June 4, 2025, Marcus Reed will face execution by nitrogen hypoxia at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, where his fate will be sealed. George John Hansen. In August 1999, a crime of unthinkable brutality unfolded in Tulsa, Oklahoma. George John Hansen, along with his accomplice Victor Miller, orchestrated a carjacking that would ultimately lead to the tragic death of 77-year-old Mary B. At the Tulsa Mall, the 2 men forcibly abducted Mary, taking her to a remote, desolate dirt pit near AASO, Oklahoma. There, they ended her life in a violent and senseless act. But the horror didn't stop there. Victor Miller, fearing that Gerald Max Thurman had witnessed the crime, decided to silence him as well. He murdered Thurman, ensuring that no one could speak out against their actions. Hansen, already serving a life sentence in a Louisiana federal prison for a bank robbery, was convicted of Mary B's murder and sentenced to death for his role in the horrific events. In 2025, Hansen's fate took a new turn when he was transferred from the Louisiana federal prison to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. This move came after a request from Oklahoma's Attorney General Gentner Drummond, which Hansen tried to block. The U.S. Department of Justice sided with the transfer, and Attorney General Pam Bondi filed the final memorandum ordering the shift. Despite his new location, Hansen's legal battle wasn't over. His attorney, Emma Rolls, has made a compelling case for clemency, arguing that Hansen has been a peaceful prisoner valued by the correctional staff for his contributions to the prison community. Furthermore, Rolls claims that Hansen's trial was tainted. His co-defendant, Miller, had boasted about being the real killer, information that was never presented during the trial. The trial judge herself had even felt that this omission warranted a life sentence instead of death. Despite these last-ditch appeals, Hansen's execution is scheduled for June 12, 2025, by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. The legal fight may continue, but for now, Hansen's fate is sealed. Byron Black. Byron Black's name became synonymous with tragedy after the brutal killings of his girlfriend, Angela Clay, and her 2 young daughters, LaToya and LaKeisha, in Nashville, Tennessee, in 1988. The killings were the culmination of a jealous rage, as Black, at the time serving a sentence for shooting and wounding Clay's estranged husband, lashed out violently against the woman and her children. Black's actions were driven by jealousy, but the aftermath of his case became even more complex over the years. His defense team has consistently raised the issue of intellectual disability, arguing that this condition should make him ineligible for execution. Tennessee law, which once had no clear mechanism for addressing such claims, now has a legal pathway allowing defendants to present evidence of intellectual disabilities that could potentially spare them from the death penalty. In an unusual turn of events, Both Black's defense attorneys and Nashville prosecutors agreed that he is intellectually disabled, a move that would have set the stage for a resentencing to life without parole. Yet, the Tennessee Attorney General's office has fought back against this appeal, stating that Black should still face execution. His case has sparked fierce debate, not only due to the severity of his crime, but because of the profound ethical questions raised by his intellectual condition. Black was originally scheduled for execution in 2020, but the COVID-19 pandemic led to delays, pushing the date back twice. Now, at 66 years old, Byron Black continues his battle in the courts, claiming that his execution would be unjust due to his intellectual disability. But as of now, the state of Tennessee remains firm in its decision, and Black is set to be executed on August 5th, 2025. Donnie Middlebrooks, April 26, 1987, started as just another day at the flea market on Gallatin Road in East Nashville, Tennessee. But for 14-year-old Kareem Major, it would be the last day of his life. He had gone to the market with a group of friends, but what began as a simple visit quickly spiraled into a deadly encounter. When Major and his friends were accused of trying to steal items from the market, they fled, hoping to escape the confrontation. But the flea market's vendors, 24-year-old Donald Middlebrooks, his wife Tammy, and 16-year-old Roger Brewington, weren't going to let them get away that easily. The chase was on, and soon they had Major cornered. Brewington quickly put Major into a sleeper hold, using a racial slur as the terrified teen begged for his life. What followed was a night of unimaginable cruelty. From 7:30 p.m. to 11 p.m., Major was held captive, tortured, and subjected to relentless physical abuse. The two men, fueled by hate and malice, used knives to carve out Major's suffering. For 10 to 30 minutes, Major endured his torment, conscious for part of the ordeal. The horror didn't end there. The next day, Brewington and Middlebrooks returned to the scene, where Brewington carved an X through Major's chest and Middlebrooks covered his body with a foam mattress. At trial, Middlebrooks tried to downplay his role, claiming that Brewington was the driving force behind the crime. But the evidence painted a different picture. Middlebrooks had actively participated in every step of the torture and murder. The jury convicted him of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. Middlebrooks was initially scheduled for execution in 2022, but due to complications with lethal injection protocols, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee issued a temporary reprieve. With the state's new execution protocols now in place, Middlebrooks has been given a new execution date, September 24th, 2025. He currently resides on death row at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, awaiting his fate. Timothy Coleman. January 2nd, 1996, was a bitterly cold evening in Springfield, Ohio, with snow and wind cutting through the streets. It was the perfect night for Timothy Coleman to carry out his grim plan. Just months earlier, Melinda Stevens, a confidential informant for the Springfield Police Department, had played a pivotal role in getting Coleman arrested for drug trafficking. She had helped law enforcement secure his indictment by making controlled purchases of crack cocaine from him on 3 separate occasions. In jail, Coleman learned the truth. Stevens had been the one who had helped get him locked up. Anger and vengeance consumed him. He confided in his cellmate, James R. White, that if he ever got out on bond, he would take care of Stevens. With a newborn baby and facing a 15 to 45-year prison sentence on drug charges, Coleman was determined to settle the score. On January 2nd, after being released on bond, Coleman tracked Stevens down. He and Stevens were seen together at Riddle's Ribs, a local restaurant, around 7 or 8 p.m. The two appeared to be buying takeout, but what happened next was chilling. Moments later, a witness, Christopher Holtz, saw Coleman and Stevens alone in an alley. That's when he heard gunshots. Holtz would later reveal to a fellow inmate that Coleman had fired 2 shots at the back of Stevens' head using a Davis P380 firearm. Coleman had intentionally chosen the blizzardy weather, believing the snow and cold would hinder the investigation. The forensic pathologist confirmed that Stevens died from 2 gunshot wounds, one to the back of her head and another to the base of her neck. Coleman was convicted of aggravated murder, with a death specification added due to his motive of murdering a witness to prevent her testimony. Now, nearly 3 decades after the murder, his execution is scheduled for October 30th, 2025. Kareem M. Jackson. Ohio was a cold night on March 25, 1997, when Kareem M. Jackson and 4 accomplices decided to carry out a robbery that would turn into a nightmare for the residents of a Columbus, Ohio apartment. The plan seemed simple: break in, steal what they could, and escape. But things escalated quickly when Jackson, in the heat of the moment, struck one of the occupants over the head and threatened her life. Despite the frantic pleas for mercy from 2 other residents, Jackson's brutality only intensified. He coldly executed them by placing pillows behind their heads and then pulling the trigger. The scene was one of horror and senseless violence. The lives of those innocent victims were stolen in an instant. Jackson wasn't caught right away. It took 3 days, but on March 28th, he was arrested, charged with 2 counts of murder and robbery. The trial was swift, and Jackson was sentenced to death. But even as the years have passed, his execution has been delayed, primarily due to ongoing issues with Ohio's execution protocol and the availability of lethal injection drugs. Now, after spending 28 years on death row, Jackson is set to face justice on December 10th, 2025. But in that time, his case has become a symbol of the complicated legal and ethical battles surrounding the death penalty. Harold Wayne Nichols, Tennessee. The night of September 30th, 1988, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was supposed to be like any other, but for 21-year-old Karen Pulley, it would be a night of terror that would cost her life. Harold Wayne Nichols broke into Pulley's home in the Brainerd area, armed with a twisted purpose. Finding Karen alone in her bedroom, Nichols brutally assaulted her. When she resisted, he struck her not once, but at least twice with a 2x4 he had picked up after breaking in. The next morning, one of Karen's roommates made a horrific discovery. Karen was lying on the floor in a pool of blood next to her bed. Though she was still alive, Karen would succumb to her injuries the following day. Nichols had left her for dead, but the damage was done. Months later, while Nichols was in custody for unrelated charges, he confessed to the crime. Investigators soon uncovered his chilling history. Nichols had been prowling the streets of Chattanooga, hunting for vulnerable women. By the time of his trial, Nichols was already facing charges for 5 additional assaults on other women. His violent spree, it seemed, had only just begun. Now, after years of legal battles, Nichols is scheduled for execution on December 11th, 2025. Because his crime occurred before 1999, Nichols has the right to choose his method of execution. The state will notify him of the chosen method on November 26th. But the pain and devastation he caused will forever be a part of Chattanooga's history. If you found these stories gripping, be sure to subscribe for more real-life cases that shake the world to its core. Like this video if you think justice must be served, and share it with others to keep these important stories alive. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and let us know what you think. Your engagement helps us continue to bring you these impactful narratives.